Hello, gentlemen. Here we
Hello,
are.
hello.
In my house, we are toasting to democracy. Got these little fancy champagne flutes even out. Um, Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you at another Dispatch Live, but this one, of course, is special because it's election night in America. So we've got Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, David French, you know all that. I'm Sarah Isger, and tonight we will be looking into our cameras far less than usual because we've got all of our screens open, our phones, just like you. Plus, I've got Caleb, our awesome producer, in the chats, trying to give me information since I am not in the room with my TV. So with that, we've all been sitting on text all night, guys, sharing our little nuggets of genius amongst ourselves.
Nuggets of something.
Nuggets of something.
I could have some nuggets right now.
Chicky nuggies. Steve, I'm going to start with you. You said something really interesting in our chat, and I wanted to start off the conversation. We don't know who has won tonight, but there is something that I think we all agree on, which is, but for coronavirus, Trump would have been reelected. Whether he is or not, it turns out.
I think that's maybe, one of the, aside from the results, obviously, one of the big takeaways here is that coronavirus, its presence as an issue, the president's handling of it, is the widespread disapproval of it, the continuing concern of it, is something that really hurt the president. But absent that, given everything that we've seen and given the kind of neck and neck fight that we're watching as the results pour in, seems pretty clear to me that in the absence of it, without anything like a global pandemic killing 230,000 Americans, President Trump would have won re-election, and probably would have won re-election pretty easily.
I want to circle back to this topic. We're going to hit some quick ones here. David French, the polling, not great this year. Florida, already definitely off. And Ohio, Trump's now up 3%. The last average on 538 had the Ohio average at 0.9. North Carolina, if he pulls it out, I mean, it's not looking good.
Well, for sure on Florida, David A. French, call for a complete and total shutdown of Florida polling until we can figure out what's going on. North Carolina and Ohio were like this in the polling average anyway, and it looks like they'll end up like this. So, the pollsters in their defense will say margin of error, but the Florida miss is a big miss. It's a big miss.
I hear you on the margin of error, but they were all wrong the same way again.
Exactly.
And that's the problem. It's not that they just are like, oh, they're getting it wrong here, wrong there, but it's all within the margin. I think we'd all be fine with that. We don't expect them to have a crystal ball into the future, but we do expect them not to be wrong the same direction every single time of underrepresenting Trump voters and then telling everyone they're crazy for thinking they're underrepresenting Trump voters.
Well, and this is after saying, well, we figured out what we did. We figured out how we got it wrong. Right. And so this time we've got it right. And I part of me wonders if, one of the surprises seems to be the Hispanic vote for Trump seems to be much higher than people anticipated. Some of the numbers that you're seeing in Florida, in Georgia, in Ohio, a significant increase in Hispanic support, almost up to the sort of the George W. Bush numbers, some of them in the 40% range. And I saw a smart take from Florida saying that a lot of this sort of the sort of radicalizing you saw with the defund the police and the Che Guevara shirts and all of that just doesn't play well with a lot of more culturally and moderate Hispanic voters. It just doesn't reach them, and in fact repels them. And so, this could be an interesting election where you have actually Biden does better with white voters and then falls short with Black and Hispanic voters, which is not what people would have anticipated.
So Jonah, what we do know so far is that this will not be a wave election on either side. Trump's not going to win in a landslide and Biden's not going to win in a landslide at this point. To me, that is the worst case scenario for both parties in a way, because let's assume for a second that Biden pulls this out and that Pennsylvania goes his way eventually, although I doubt we'll have that tonight. Doesn't, or rather, what do you make of the idea that with so many voters disliking Trump in the approval numbers, in character questions, on even trust on various issues, including the coronavirus, that means that the rest of the Democrats' message must be such a turnoff to voters that their entire agenda is being rejected basically tonight, except for the fact that Joe Biden isn't Donald Trump?
Yeah, I'm very tempted to say let's wait and see on a lot of these propositions, including some of the ones that have already been floated. I mean, for example, on the COVID point, I don't know that that's true that Trump would have won were it not for COVID. I do think, not because I think that's an implausible argument or obviously wrong. It may be right. Just contrafactuals are always very difficult to do. But it seems to me that the one thing we know is that is the narrative. If Trump does lose, that will be the narrative about why he lost. And as Ross Douthat said on Twitter recently, or earlier tonight, the prospects of Donald Trump, if he doesn't win, running in 2024 have gone up dramatically tonight. And I think that's something to keep in mind. On the polling part, I agree that the problem isn't that they were wrong, it's that they were directionally wrong the same way again. And if and this is a point I'll have to eat crow on, and if trends continue tonight, I may have to eat far worse than crow. But the pollsters said that the problem in 2016 is they didn't screen accordingly, they didn't weight accordingly based upon non-college educated, which is really basically just a stand-in for class in a lot of ways. And they said they fixed that. Well, okay, if you fixed it, then you shouldn't have these problems. We don't know exactly what the problems with the polling were yet. I suspect that maybe the problem with the polling is that pollsters actually really stink at polling an electorate, half of whom have already voted, and the other half of whom are really jazzed to all vote in one day. And I don't know the math. It's all witchcraft to me, but it could have thrown everything off. I do think, though, I actually wrote this column, I don't know, 2 months ago, that I think in some ways for the country, there's a lot of good news in the idea that Hispanics and blacks broke for Trump. I would have rather they broke for someone like Mitt Romney or George W. Bush and all that, but just simply shattering this foregone conclusion that non-white voters are Democratic voters congenitally or genetically is really poisonous to democracy and problematic. And actually to discover that you actually have to win over voters based on something else, I think is important. Just now to answer your question, I have no idea if this is impugning of the Democrats' agenda or not. I am moving more and more towards the idea that people vote on entertainment value far more than they should. And if he had more entertaining Democrat promising socialism, he would have done better. And if you had a less entertaining Republican promising nationalism, he would have done worse. So I don't know. I got to think about it more.
Fair enough. Steve, we have a question from Matt. Even with today's returns, is there any reason to think that Trump can win your home state or Michigan?
Oh, sure. I think Trump could win both of those states. The polling in Wisconsin was pretty decisive, especially the late polling. But the plan you talked to Trump campaign folks, and they had said from the beginning, one of the things that they were going to do was wring out more votes from the white working class voters that Jonah mentioned. There was still vote to get for the Trump campaign. I think pollsters certainly were skeptical that they would be able to do that. I shared some of that skepticism, and I think it remains to be seen whether they'll be able to do it in the long run. I would say, just given the early returns and what we've seen so far, both Michigan and Wisconsin feel like they're states that could end up in the Biden tally. But we probably won't know Wisconsin until tomorrow. There was a report out that they're not going to be fully counting Milwaukee County until 5 a.m. Central Time tomorrow. So that's 6 a.m. Eastern Time. So it seems pretty clear that, and I think along with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin will hold up potentially a declaration of a winner and could make this thing go on for certainly many, many more hours and potentially many, many more days.
So let's check in with my sweep column today, some counties that I've been watching. Going to North Carolina, if you read the sweep today, you saw that I highlighted Cumberland County, which is Fayetteville, and that Hillary Clinton underperformed there in 2016, but that there was a tight congressional race there that in theory was going to turn out a lot more Black voters, and whether that congressional candidate was on Biden's coattails or Biden would be on her coattails was going to be interesting. But either way, Biden really needed to turn out his voters in Fayetteville, and you were looking at needing an 18 to 20 point win there. And lo and behold, Biden is winning by less than 17 points. So that is a disappointment for the Biden team in one of their big turnout counties there. Also looking at little Lenoir County, my little favorite county, the tiny but mighty Lenoir. It is in the country been one of the county's top 10 to every time since 1992 reflect within a point, basically, the statewide results. And Lenoir County right now with 98% reporting has Donald Trump ahead by 4 points. Roughly about 3.4. Is what I'm seeing here. So, for Lenoir, if they're right the same way they've been every other time, that's looking at a Trump win in North Carolina, certainly, and maybe one upwards of 2 points. All right, David, with that, what have you been watching tonight that surprised you the most outside of Florida? Let's leave Florida behind. Tell us what else. I thought Georgia and North Carolina would come out differently. My expectation was you would see a larger wave in the suburbs after 2018. The way things worked in 2018 were very interesting. You had a big polling miss in Florida, and then basically everything worked out the way folks thought 2018 would work out with a Democrat wave. But what's I'm getting these flashbacks to 2012. And I keep remembering in 2012, you would get these numbers in and they would say, Romney is outperforming 08 McCain. Well, that's fine, but 08 McCain lost pretty substantially in some of these states. And so when you say, well, Biden is going to outperform Hillary, not in Florida, but in a lot of these other states, but by not enough. And what that's going to lead us to is we're walking down the primrose path to where it's narrowed in a bunch of states that Trump won pretty substantially. And then you've got the big three. You've got and
Pennsylvania.
The popular vote. Don't forget, if Trump wins now, we're heading towards an even more substantial popular vote win than Hillary Clinton had in 2016, which you want to talk about something that's not great for the country. There's one.
Yeah, we're walking down a path towards a situation that is going to be extremely tense. It's looking like a situation that could be extremely tense for the next several days, perhaps, with a bigger popular vote win for Biden if these numbers are holding. And it's kind of the scenario that a lot of people worried about going in, but the widening polling averages beginning in September kind of eased a lot of people's fears, and we're right back where we were, worried about a lot of this inherent tension and instability surrounding a super close vote count with this popular vote hovering in the background.
Jonah, the gender gap looks as big as we expected it to, but I'm not sure that it's fully sunk in what that means for the country. In 1860, obviously, there was a regional gap that divided the country into two, and that spoiler alert, it didn't end super well in that sense. I don't even know, we don't have any historical reference that I'm aware of, any country in the world where the political parties are going to be this divided on gender, where if you meet a woman, she is most likely to belong to the Democratic Party and not by a little. And if you meet a man, he is most likely to belong to the Republican Party and not by a little. What does that mean for the future of the country?
First of all, I just want you to be concerned that if Media Matters is monitoring this, they're going to spin this as you saying the Civil War didn't end well. Just be careful about that.
Fair enough. Let me clarify right now. I meant that regional Hatreds did not end well for the country. Slavery ended, and that
Right.
was a very good thing.
That was a good thing. So it's funny. Chris Matthews, who, as you may not have noticed, literally just dematerialized about 6 months ago and has completely vanished from the national consciousness. But for a long time, he was a pretty prominent figure around, and he used to, long time ago, used to write some smart and interesting things about politics. And he was the one who promulgated, I think in '88, that the Democrats were becoming the mommy party and the Republicans were becoming the daddy party. And this is an idea that you can trace all the way back to like the 19th century, but it had some legs for a while in the 90s. And there was this idea that the Democratic Party is the nurturing party and the Republican Party is the party that goes around making sure everyone's safe and all the doors are locked. And for a while, it seemed like the Republicans were trying to compensate for that with compassionate conservatism and all that. And now it looks like we're sort of getting it in some ways on steroids. And I am more sympathetic to mommy party stuff in some ways than I was 20 years ago when I was a younger man. It turns out that women in a lot of countries in Europe turn out to be kind of better rulers than men do for a bunch of different reasons. But I think that in American politics, we don't know how to talk about this stuff without a certain strain of meritocratic feminism dominating the women's side of the argument, and a certain strain of now sort of Trumpy, cartoonish masculinity dominating that strain. And that portends a really ugly conversation, I think, because people are going to talk past each other. They're going to hold up the other one as a caricature of what the other side really holds on to or believes. And we saw this guy in Western North Carolina who just won, the youngest guy running for Congress.
Madison Cawthorn.
Yeah. His first, literally his first tweet is "Cry more, lib." This is like the idea of masculinity for Republicans of a certain sort these days.
Yeah.
And that's not a good sign. And so the only prediction I have been right about for the last 10 years is things can get dumber. And I have never, ever been more confident in my prognosticatory powers than I am right now.
All right, Steve, question from Keith. Are we seeing a realignment where Democrats have college-educated whites and Republicans have more socially conservative minorities?
Yeah, I mean, very possibly. It's hard to tell from, you don't want to extrapolate too much from the South Florida results, but I was texting with a friend of mine, Alberto Martinez, who's worked in Florida politics for a long time and has been making basically this argument about Hispanics in Florida for a long time. And, he said, as it relates in particular to Hispanic voters in South Florida, he said, look, it turns out that socialism isn't theoretical to many of these voters, particularly newer Hispanic voters in South Florida. And so when you have a Democratic Party that so openly floats with socialism, I mean, Bernie Sanders was a South Carolina away from potentially being the Democratic nominee. That was scary to some people in a way that he said it wasn't for people of his generation, which I thought was a pretty smart observation. Remains to be seen how much that will carry across the country, but certainly we're seeing the contours of that kind of change. I mean, both David and Jonah have written about it before. This sort of the growing gap between the elites, the urban and suburban elites, and white working class voters, but also potentially, again, depending on what we learn, non-white working class voters. And it becomes a much more class-focused divide between the parties than we might have thought. What's really interesting to think about is how you look at, Democrats long thought that the path to success was identity politics. And maybe this gives them pause if we actually see this play out. And it's a much more class-based argument than they had anticipated.
By the way, Steve, if you can speak up a little more, folks are having a little trouble hearing you.
I can shout.
Yeah, so your microphone is is picking up a little soft there.
Sorry, I can do that.
Not to worry. David, why is it taking so long to call Florida? Asked Mike.
I'm stumped. I'm stumped at that. I mean, the die is cast in Florida. It's been cast for a while, but I asked that very question on Twitter, and my friends at Decision Desk HQ, I don't know if you follow those, they said they've called Florida ages ago. So, and they're reliable, they're strong. One thing to pick up on some of the thread of the conversation, look, we've been talking about negative polarization for a really long time. And it just might be the fact that we're too negatively polarized for the kind of 92/96 style election win that I'll be honest, I thought was quite possible. I thought was, I thought it was probable. I mean, Sarah, you've been very kind to not dunk on me yet, because in advisory opinions, plug, I projected it was going to be a more of a 92-96 style victory for Biden, because silly me, I looked at the polls and I figured that they had corrected the errors. I thought they had corrected the errors. And if anything, I wondered if they'd overcorrected the errors. But I should have, trusted like all the research I did for my book that says we're really negatively polarized.
The ground
and
game's in our hearts, David.
Yeah, ground games in our hearts. And the core of negative polarization is you're not voting for your guy as much as you're voting against the other guy. And yeah, Trump has a very loyal core that will crawl over broken glass to vote for him. But the message to the rest of the Trump voters is anything but the Democrats. And so when that message gets through, like, these waves are just not in the cards.
Can I make one quick point, just a point about the polling? It's important to remember, it wasn't just the polling that kind of led people astray here. It wasn't just the public polling that led people astray here. You had private polling from Democrats and from Republicans that were coming to the same conclusions, finding the same things. I mean, we've talked before here and in Dispatch podcast about the plunge that Republican pollsters in particular saw after the president's performance in the first debates. For some of them, it was 8 to 10 points for the president, but 8 to 10 points in the generic ballot for Republicans. So you saw this, and now they'll have to ask themselves the same kind of questions that we'll see public pollsters have to answer if these trends continue this way. But it was not only the public polling, it was the private polling, and it's important to remember that Republicans built campaign strategies to solve for those things.
Jonah, let's talk about the Senate. I'm talking to a lot of Senate Republican operatives tonight, and they're feeling very good compared to the way they were feeling 2 weeks ago, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, if Trump gets reelected, they need to win 4 seats to take back the Senate, and not just 3. The Cory Gardner thing seemed inevitable, and that's
right. The Colorado to Alabama trade.
Right.
That was like a hostage negotiation, basically.
But I don't know. I mean, Susan Collins is still outstanding, right? I mean,
Tillis is some of the results I'm looking at now, and it's super tight. But right now, Tillis is up a point in 1.3 last time I've checked here, and he's ahead of Trump at this point.
Yeah, and Ossoff is like really trailing last I saw, but I so little trust these numbers because I don't know half the time whether they're reporting same election day or mail-in or this these counties but not those counties, or whether they're from Mordor or they're from Gryffindor. I don't know, but it will be. Look, I'm on the same proposition that things can get dumber. I'm moving more and more towards the 269 to 269 electoral college, decided by Amy Coney Barrett in a duel scenario, because that's just how it feels right now. At the very minimum, I've Steve has been more worried about this than I've been, but I think we probably won't know who controls the Senate. We probably won't know who controls the White House for a few days, and people kind of need to buckle up. But other than that, I got no profound insights about the Senate other than it looks like the Republicans may in fact hold on to the Senate, which it, from my own partisan perspective, might be the better thing for the country, and actually for, particularly if Joe Biden wins, probably better for Joe Biden as well.
Steve, super important question here from A, whoever you are out there. I've been telling my mom for weeks to relax because Trump has little chance of winning. How do I save face if he wins?
That's a good question. Tell her that you were relying on the pollsters, the same pollsters that we were all relying on, and that the Republicans were relying on, and that we told you. Look, I mean, I think it's a real question. I think if it's, I was just looking at the tally from The Economist, which was one of the projections that we talked about in the Dispatch Live that we, I think we've included in a couple editions of the Morning Dispatch. We looked at 538. We looked at the public polling. The Economist, their data analyst tweeted out this morning that Joe Biden had a 19 in 20 chance of winning the Electoral College. Now, he's not yet wrong. That may still end up happening. Trump's path is still actually relatively narrow. He's overperforming certainly what the public polls would have suggested, but he has to win a bunch of things in order to win the Electoral College. So it's not yet the case that that's wrong, but it's certainly the case that the margins in the polling and what people expected are not. That is not what's unfolding.
So, David, interesting note back to the Senate here. Something that you and I have talked about on Advisory Opinions, plug.
Yes.
Is that there's really the death of the split ticket voter is one of the big stories of the last decade. And when we concentrate so much on cycles, we kind of miss some of those slow moving tectonic shifts that actually make enormous differences in election outcomes. And so, interestingly, this time around, to talk about the Senate differently from the president, the race for president, may be kind of a pointless conversation. And I'm looking right now, and what's fun about doing it right now when we don't have all the votes in is that you can see those tracking together. So like, for instance, in Michigan, where we only have 33% in, John James is up 55 to Gary Peters 42. Those same 33% of votes had Donald Trump 54 to Joe Biden's 43. They're barely 1 point off of one another. So that's the only split ticket voters we have. So I guess my question to you, David, is do we even need to watch the Senate races, or is this just going to like rise and fall like a slip at the marina with the tide?
I think it's right. It's going with the tide. I mean, if you look at Tillis in North Carolina, he just barely took the lead and is extending that lead right now, just as Trump barely took the lead and is extending that lead in North Carolina. So, yeah, we could entirely be watching this sort of rising of the tide and falling of the tide with the president. And, you know, if Trump overperforms, just as a tactical, let me say this, if he continues to overperform, because he's obviously overperforming so far, if he continues to overperform, just as a pure tactical matter, for your electoral fortunes, all those people telling GOP senators, put daylight between you and Trump, were wrong. They were wrong. And, and I think that this is one thing that I've been
That was McSally's bet, by the way, who looks like actually she will not track Trump's vote, but they were telling her, basically, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Yeah. You may lose, but if you distance yourself from them, you're definitely going to lose. And so she's going to lose,
Right. Exactly. So,
I'm starting to think McSally's a bad candidate. I know I'm not a huge judge of these kinds of things, but it just feels that way.
2 losses in 2 years, Jonah. I don't know. I don't know if we have enough sample size.
Held 2 different Senate seats, never winning an election. It's really an amazing thing.
I have a question for you on the Electoral College. Talking with some friends today. Obviously, I think all of us have all of our text chats on fire today on election day. It's like the time you talk to your high school friends you haven't spoken to in years. And also, it doesn't help when you're like a pundit for a living, because then all of your friends, basically what happens is my friends' parents are like, what does Sarah say? So I get all these texts like, my mom, who hasn't seen you in 15 years since carpool, wants to know what's going on. 15 years is being very generous to my age. Sorry. So we were talking about the Electoral College, and I obviously some of them want to get rid of the Electoral College. And we were talking about sort of the philosophical underpinnings of whether to keep it or not. But one of them asked me a good question, which is fine. If you want to keep the Electoral College, why don't we move to the Nebraska and Maine system where it's done by congressional district, so that at least you don't have what could end up being tonight a massive discrepancy between the Electoral College. And regardless of if you think the Electoral College is good, you can at least acknowledge that having lots of elections where the popular vote is different than the Electoral College outcome is just not great for the relations in the country and the belief in a representative government that people have, because they don't understand the Electoral College. So what do you think of this Nebraska Maine plan?
I'm less opposed to it than, it's like the National Voter Compact thing. I think that is a reasonable suggestion about how to fix what people think is the problem with the Electoral College. And one of the reasons why it's reasonable is that if it ends up not working for any state, they can pull out of it. Mm-hmm. Right. The straight, let's just get rid of the Electoral College stuff. First of all, it's basically saying, let's just take a giant Sharpie to a big chunk of the Constitution, and you're never going to be able to do that. Right. It's so welded into the constitutional structure that a simple amendment almost can't do that. So something like that doesn't bother me that much. I'm also in favor of expanding the size of the House to about 5,000 members. Which, let us recall, was the actual First Amendment before this interloper amendment came in. And
the best amendment.
And maybe, but that's only because the one that said keeping the House proportional to population was shelved. But anyway, look, I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, and I think it could solve some of the problems. I don't know that it's a solution that you could actually get through the process required to make it happen. So it's fun to sort of do the mathematical models on, and it's sort of, I'm willing to compromise a little and say that's better than just having national popular vote for it.
It would have to be led by the swing states, right? Because a single party state, California, is not going to move to this plan because all they do is lose Democratic electoral votes, because some would go to Republicans. So you'd have to have it led by, the Ohios of the world, the Floridas of the world, where it wouldn't, you don't have single party control. And so they don't know whether their party is going to win next time around, and they're willing to hedge their bets. But I don't know that I've seen a lot of hunger for bet hedging.
Yeah. So wouldn't that, just as a point of clarification, wouldn't that, given how districts are drawn, wouldn't that exacerbate these problems in a pretty significant way? A nightmare.
What? You don't think our redistricting fights are brutal enough?
Yeah. One of my favorite lines from The Simpsons is when Homer says, I think it's to Beer, the cause of and answer to most of life's problems. And I could be butchering that a little bit, but California is the cause of and the answer to most of the problems that people have with the Electoral College. If you just broke that thing up into like 4 different states, it would solve most of the things that Democrats want, which is more senators and to have more clout in presidential elections and all of that stuff. But there's this weird thing is like, the same people who don't believe in sort of nationalism and don't believe in even federalism at the same time really passionately believe that California should stay, this massive thing that distorts all of our politics. And I'm for, break all these things up, give them more power, and let people live the way they want to live, and people will care about the Electoral College less.
The number one question, by the way, from Haiku Jonah is, which of you touched the orb?
We all touched the orb.
Yeah, I was going to say we had a symbolic Zoom orb touching before this started.
Forgot to mention that our Zoom. Another popular one: are we meeting in Elba or St. Helena this cycle? Guys, really dark out there.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right, real question, Steve. Are we seeing shy Trump voters? Is that what's happening right now?
Yeah, I think that has to be part of the explanation. I'm not sure it's the full explanation, but that has to be part of the explanation, along with the weighting questions. And look, again, depending on how much we can extrapolate the results from South Florida to the rest of the country, and if we in fact see that President Trump has one more votes of minority voters. Yeah, that you'll have to say that was part of the miss. And I would just point out, as I'm continuing to look at this, I think the likelihood that we are going to go, not just past tonight, but probably for days, seems to be increasing every minute. I mean, maybe we'll be surprised and some of these things will resolve themselves in ways that they don't look like they're doing now. But there are major mail-in ballots to be counted in Pennsylvania, 2.2 million to be counted in Pennsylvania. You've got the Wisconsin thing that I mentioned earlier. You've got other mail-in votes. I mean, even in North Carolina, you're looking at the results here, but North Carolina can count its votes up to November 12th if they're postmarked today. So you could see, maybe not enough to change the result there, depending on what's been counted and what's been added. This stuff is all really, really fluid. And I think the one thing that we can say is it's more likely to continue than it is to be resolved quickly.
All right. What else is going on? David, the Trump folks said they were going to win this in a landslide. That will turn out not to be true in terms of landslide per state, but he is expanding his performance from 2016 in a lot of these states, and including in some of these counties in Pennsylvania. We obviously don't know the results of the state. Fox is now giving Republicans a 90% chance of holding the Senate. What did the Trump team know that no one else seemed to know in the mainstream media? And that's the question.
I mean, I think the Trump team knows people love him. I mean, that there is this enormous enthusiasm. I was telling some of you guys before we went on live during the day today, there was almost like a pre-celebration for Trump where I live. The Trump trucks were driving up and down the streets with the big flags, and people were honking and waving and yelling, not yelling like they would in Brooklyn, but yelling like they would in Tennessee. And there was something real about when it came to his base, the enthusiasm. And then there's also something real when it comes to the anger and the fear of the Democrats. The Democrats have moved left. They have moved left. And, one of the things that you see is that a lot of people who are ambivalent, they're truly sort of tortured. There will be things that the Democrats didn't have to do, but they did, like pledging to restore public funding, to repeal the Hyde Amendment, have public funding for abortion. They did that. They didn't have to do that. They don't need to secure more Brooklyn votes. They don't need more San Francisco votes, but they went towards, we're going to have public funding for abortion. And so you had the combination, I think, as the Trump folks know, of that adoration. And then just a lot of people who say the Democrats have gone too far. And I think that they knew that. I mean, I think that's where conservative media, for all of its flaws, has its fingers on the pulse of where a lot of people are. Now, again, this is what we're probably talking about, still a minority of Americans, and maybe even a smaller minority than in 2016 of Americans, but clustered in all the right places geographically to either win or to come very close to winning.
Steve, one thing that really separated 2020 from 2016, I think both were turnout elections, whether they knew it in 2016 or not. This time they definitely knew this was a turnout election. Right. And the Trump team did, a field program, going door to door, being in person, knocking, having field operation on steroids. It's a field operation that we have never seen in presidential politics in the history of the country. The Biden team did it all virtually. And both sides obviously spent just more money than any of us can imagine. Yep. What does that mean for campaign tactics and their effectiveness?
Well, so I just need to flip this right back to you, because you've written about this. You know the campaigns far better than I do. I was texting with a Republican operative earlier tonight, and this came up. And so I guess I would ask just ask the exact same question to you. I mean, does it matter? I mean, I think there was an assumption that the Trump folks were taking a big risk in doing this in a pandemic, not only a literal physical risk, but a risk in sending the wrong message to a populace that in poll after poll after poll suggested that they were concerned about these things.
And there were all the late night jokes that they were killing their own voters.
Right, but if it was the case that they were really cranking up the turnout operation to turn out white working class voters, particularly in rural parts of the country, who have not been nearly as affected by the pandemic in terms of like the day-to-day differences to their lives, were they just incredibly successful on that? I mean, it's probably too early to tell, but interested in your thoughts.
It's interesting because Biden is outperforming Hillary, but you could chalk that up to Joe Biden not being Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And one thing that we did see that made me think, ground games do matter more than the Biden team maybe thought, was when they acknowledged that they were starting a door-to-door program. And they said there are some voters, not many, but some, that were having trouble reaching via telephone. And so we're going to go knock on their doors. And, at that moment, you're like, you just figured out that people don't like not robocalls that are automated, but, strangers calling them. And it is different. For those who don't live in swing counties, it is really different getting a random phone call from someone you don't know in the middle of dinner and you've got the baby or whatever else is going on, and having someone who is, you may not know them, but they're your neighbor in the sense that, their accent's going to sound like yours. They're going to look like you. They may know someone that you know, for instance, and they're just going to talk to you at your door for a few minutes. There's a reason that's more effective than a bunch of these cold touches. That's a really warm touch. So I'm not shocked that it turns out to make a difference. I guess to the extent I'm surprised, the sweep is named after this idea that this analogy that I had, that campaign tactics in general don't make big differences. I don't know. I said that I was looking forward to 2020 because we were really going to test ground games and whether, in fact, that did make a big difference when one side unilaterally basically disarmed. I think we could be seeing the ground games make a big difference, because look on the flip side, the Trump campaign went down on TV in a lot of these places, and that clearly wasn't enough. So TV alone, all the other things they were matched on, or the Trump campaign was not as good. Ground game was the one thing where the Trump campaign just turned it up to like 11s. So I think that's really a fascinating part of tonight, especially when you see that turnout in Miami-Dade, like just some of these turnout numbers where he's pulling more voters than he got in 2016. And it's not close. He's not getting a few hundred more voters or a few thousand. Like we're seeing 5-digit, 6-digit number turnout increases. And in swing states, not in Texas, which, by the way, is still not a swing state.
That's another big polling miss right there. That's a big polling miss.
I could have told you that. Oh my God. By the way,
Sarah, can I follow up though? Let me ask you another question, since you know this stuff so well. I think it's been increasingly clear that money and television ads don't matter as much in presidential campaigns as sort of conventional wisdom held for really decades. And I think it was true of the primaries and is potentially true of a general election. I mean, the primaries, remember when Rick Santorum won the Iowa caucuses or tied Mitt Romney in the Iowa caucuses, and I think he had $25,000 in his bank account when it happened. He was not spending heavily on television. I think we've seen that in sort of glimpses in the subsequent years. But in this case, the Biden campaign outspent the Trump campaign, on television 2-1. Democrats
in many
running
states 3-1
in Senates, Democrats running in Senate races had massive cash advantages over Republicans. And again, with the caveat that there's a lot we don't know, things could change. It seems at least possible that we're getting more evidence that money just doesn't matter as much as people have thought.
Well, there's a few things. One, there's certainly diminishing returns, right? Spending $300 million on a race, okay, for presidency, spending $1 billion. Okay. At some point, $7 billion can't do more. At some point, you're just writing checks to voters and hoping that they vote for you. So we know there are diminishing
propose
returns.
that.
And certainly TV could be one of those areas. But I think where people don't put enough thought is in a campaign like this, where Donald Trump is universally known. I think he's probably the most famous human being to ever live on the planet. Ads are going to be their least effective. You really want that money on a congressional race where people don't know the candidate, name ID is low. That's where TV ads can really move numbers, because all of a sudden they're like, oh, I didn't know who this person was, and now I just know this bad stuff. Or I didn't know who this person was, and now I know these good things. I don't know that there's any ads that are particularly effective in changing what you feel in your heart about Donald Trump. And I think that's true of both sides. And I think the difference is that the Trump campaign, however that may have happened, whether they just didn't have the money for it or they actually did not think that it would be effective, really thought those in-person conversations and warmer touches, for whatever reason, were going to get their voters moving. And remember, this election, they were not trying to convince Biden voters to fall in love with Donald Trump. They were not trying to convince independent voters to fall in love with Donald Trump. They were finding Donald Trump supporting people and getting their asses to the polls. And they did. And so it's not crazy that TV isn't going to motivate people to get their butts off the couch, that going to their home maybe would.
So one caveat there. I mean, I think that's pretty much spot on, but it feels to me that, in some ways this is a declaration against interest. But Fox News, very, very helpful for honing feedback loop, the sort of Republican Trump message, reaching voters who, for understandable reasons in many respects, no longer trust the mainstream media, in fact, believe that Fox is the mainstream media. And that there's so when you say the TV doesn't work,
paid television.
Yes, I know that's what you meant, but it's worth noting that there's just an enormous number of people who think that Tucker is a completely straight shooter who's calling him like he sees it, that when he says he's the enemy of spin and political correctness and false piety, they think that that's actually sort of like the ingredients labeling on a package, and that's actually what the content of the show is. When in fact, look, Tucker's very talented and he's very smart, but what he's doing is he's making a very specific, very loaded argument, as are a lot of other people in that side of right-wing media.
But Joan, I think this is a point you've made before really well, which is, and I'm gonna butcher it compared to what you say, but Fox News has done a very good job making their voters feel like part of a group that no one else understands. And part of being in that group is being defensive of that group. It's why rallies for Donald Trump, I think, are more effective than what that Emory professor who said that rallies don't matter are. And because otherwise your example here should work the same for MSNBC, but we know it doesn't. And I think that's because, to your point, Democrats and liberals have all of the media,
right,
and all of the cultural things, except for maybe the Supreme Court, but they have, movies and television and the East Coast, higher academia, et cetera. And so there isn't that feeling of group belonging. And so when you talk about Tucker Carlson, it's not the same as a paid advertisement, not just because it doesn't have a disclaimer at the end, but because that's not even someone trying to convince you of something. That's you getting to relax, your shoulders get to drop because now you're with your people.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. He's a validator, and a legitimizer for a certain mode of argumentation, and not just Tucker. I mean, I don't mean to single out Tucker. There are lots of people on Fox, in talk radio and elsewhere, but he's sort of emblematic of it. And so anyway, I mean, I think that, tribalism is alive and well, and it actually works very well for getting out voters.
Good segue. Before I segue to it, though, another fun comment / question from the chats. Do you agree with the Babylon Bee's assessment that liquor stores won the 2020 election? Well done.
I am only smart water tonight.
I have nothing. I have nothing. My hands are empty.
I'll have you know, my first drink tonight was to do this event. I was sober until 10 o'clock or whenever we started this thing.
No, y'all, how am I? Whatever. I'm not even going to say it. David, this question's to you from Terry. Do tonight's results so far reinforce the convictions and concerns that led you to write your book?
Yes. I honestly had this thought. I had this sort of, if my prediction about this being a bigger Biden wave election than I thought, I thought there might be a polling miss, a little bit of one in Biden's favor. And we had talked about this on Advisory Opinions, and I was thinking about this perhaps a 92, 96 style win. And I had this thought, well, does that like eviscerate the thesis of my book that we're not really able, that we can't have a wave anymore, that we're much more fundamentally polarized? And I think that, again, we go back to this position of negative partisanship, that it is very difficult to have a wave. It's just very difficult. And what Jonah was talking about, sort of the comfort and the feeling of real camaraderie and relaxation and entertainment and bonding that is occurring, for example, across the length and breadth of partisan media in the US is very powerful. Yeah. It's very powerful. And what I've said to lots of people who ask me, I'm always asked, because I'm a Southern evangelical living in a very red part of a very red state. And I'm always asked to explain this. And I say, look, if you consumed the media diet of my friends and neighbors, you would have a Trump flag too. This is the environment that you're in. It's not like you have a whole bunch of people all consuming the same kinds of media, living in the same culture with all of the same concerns, and then some are reaching all of these entirely reasonable opinions based on the same set of facts. That's just not how this is working. And so, one of the things when I talk to folks about Trump, there's a lot of things that I know about Trump that they've never heard of. They've never heard of it. And this is absolutely reinforcing this notion that I talked about in my book, which is there's no social, cultural, political, or religious force that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart. And we're siloing and we're growing in greater animosity towards each other.
Steve,
other than that, things are great.
Yeah. Steve, as one of your employees, I'm going to ask this question. If it's a 269 tie, are we going to do another Dispatch Live? How's that going to work?
Yeah, I think we'll have to. We're certainly going to do a Dispatch podcast. We're going to record it at some point tomorrow. I would argue for pushing it off as late as we can till we know more. But it's not crazy to think it's a 269 tie. I know you all think I'm nuts, but it's really not crazy. If you look at the map right now, and
yes. Biden's two paths are Arizona and those Nebraska, Maine districts, plus Wisconsin and Minnesota or Michigan.
Michigan, yeah.
Or Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which are both totally feasible paths. Although the second one, I think the plus Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan seems still more plausible than Nebraska and Maine. But of course, he misses just one of those.
Then it's 269. Yeah, and look, Trump won both of those districts in 2016. There's limited polling. The limited polling suggests that Biden had an advantage going into Election Day. We know maybe how much polling we should rely on that to reach our conclusions. So look, I'm not necessarily saying that it's the most likely outcome, but it's a heck of a lot more likely as we sit here talking about it right now than it seemed 6 hours ago or 6 days ago or 6 weeks ago.
So another Dispatch Live thing, just let's float an idea out here for you guys. Another Dispatch Live. What if we do like a Jerry Lewis style Dispatch telethon, and we raise money so that we can open the Dispatch Bureau on the Aegean Sea, and we just all take turns running the bureau for 3 months out of the year, split 4 ways. And I think there's a lot of reporting to be done out there.
What do we do with Caleb? Can we get Caleb in on this? Our poor producer who languishes in the dark where none of y'all can see him making this all run so smoothly.
Now somebody's got to do 12 months worth of work.
That's
Somebody
right.
has. Yeah.
Caleb,
They don't call it the
Caleb's like my
mushroom theory of
producer in my
management for
ear.
nothing.
Caleb's like, yeah, what about me? By the way, Eric has a very important question. Doesn't tonight prove there is no force that can hope to stop Cocaine Mitch?
I mean, if
Yeah.
there's one thing that we all should have known before, it was that.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
How much
and-
money did
what
they
did
spend on
she-
Kentucky?
85 million she raised?
Unbelievable.
Is that right?
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
Something like that.
Can you just imagine what good that money could have done? It's like Mike Bloomberg's presidential race. I mean, I just think about what $900 million could have done in any number of anything. Any problem you see with the country, $900 million can help fix it. No question. So any little races you guys are watching, I bring this up because as y'all saw in the sweep, Texas 21, of course, is my pet House district that I've been watching. That's the Chip Roy versus Wendy Davis race, where sort of the two extremes are running against each other in a purple district, which was such an interesting district to watch because it just proves the point that this was a turnout election. There was no moving a Republican voter over to Wendy Davis, who had been derogatorily nicknamed Abortion Barbie, or vice versa, moving someone over to Wacko Bird Chip Roy. And at this point, Chip is up by 1,000 votes, but it's looking really tight. So again, it's going to look like a purple district once again,
Yeah.
even though it's not.
Yeah.
Fascinating to
amazing.
me. I will continue to watch that, and I hope I can just like get into all of the data weeds on that race after tonight. Anything for y'all on like that?
Well, so I voted today, and
Good for you, Jonah.
Thank you. I did it under duress, and I did not know until I did curbside voting this afternoon at 4:30 that there was a ballot initiative in DC to deprioritize prosecution of
Shrooms.
of growing psychedelic mushrooms.
Wait,
And
Jonah, how did I know this and you didn't? Come on, dude.
I think we both know the answer to that, Sarah. And
Very into fungus. That's true.
And so I voted against it, just on the conservative principle that I should vote against it.
Your ballot's secret. We'll never really know, will we?
That's true. Although I did take a picture of who I wrote in for president. You know, the Mitch Mentum for Mitch Daniels is all the way. But I'm curious to see how that turns out, because I just didn't think there was a huge, like the marijuana thing that cuts across racial, class, ethnic lines in DC in all sorts of interesting ways. The carve out for shroom growing, I mean, other than like a couple interns at Cato and maybe like Rand Paul's legislative affairs director, I just don't know who.
That's hypothetical.
Hypothetical.
The lawyers.
Yeah.
It's hypothetical.
But I mean, like, I don't know. I don't know a lot of people fill that category that got that thing on the ballot in the first place in the District of Columbia. So I'm intrigued now.
You must not have read Andrew Sullivan's his dish last week, which was about, I don't know, give or take 15,000 words on the benefits of psychedelics. So, yeah, maybe something is happening. Maybe something is happening.
All right. Any down ballot-y weird things for you, Steve, or David?
Well, I'm interested in the California ballot initiative regarding, I believe it's Proposition 16, to try to repeal the essentially anti-affirmative action constitutional amendment of many years ago. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that comes out. But how can I talk about significant national issues, Sarah, without bringing up tomorrow, oral argument? There's another vote happening. It's going to be a Supreme Court vote in Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. People are not talking about this at all.
Yeah,
but it could be
and there's nothing else going on. It's weird that that's not what everyone's talking about tonight.
It's bizarre, Sarah. It is bizarre, but it could completely revamp religious liberty law in the constitutional religious liberty doctrine in the United States of America. And there's oral arguments for that tomorrow. So I'll be looking at that
on Advisory Opinions, because not only am I going to have to stay up all night tonight, but I'm also going to have to listen to this oral argument in order to talk about it with David.
Exactly.
But don't worry, because the baby's definitely not sleeping through the night. It'll be great. I'll be on my top game, you guys. Speaking of which, before we end with Steve, Mark says, Sarah, would you show us the brisket, please? We're all kind of invested here, kind of like virtual godparents. You are. And I just love all the comments I get and emails, and it's so wonderful. And it like keeps me going through some very long nights recently.
For our new viewers and members, can you explain who the brisket is? Like why you're talking about a hunk of meat?
The brisket is my son, who is 4.5 months old now. He is sleeping right now. He's only woken up twice since we've been doing this. My husband is on brisket duty right now, so I'm not going to wake him up. That is, you never wake a sleeping baby. But here's a picture that I have not posted on social media of something that I did a couple days ago. So I'll show you guys this. That is the brisket chilling with JBS, as we call him, getting a little attorney general action there. He had not gotten a medium yet, because obviously I was quite concerned about the virus, but JBS insisted. So that was really fun for us to get to hang out and get some pictures. And then I just sort of stayed away and took pictures from far. So thank you for asking. He's doing great. He says hi to all of you. The brisket, JBS, okay. Not so much. All right, Steve, we're ending with you. Thing you're watching tonight that is not the top of the ticket.
I'm looking at the impact on the Green Bay Packers COVID diagnoses on the likelihood that they'll win on Thursday night.
And Wisconsin.
Wisconsin's had to put off 2 football games. The Packers had a running back that was diagnosed yesterday. They have their starting running back has a calf strain. 2 other players, and several other players actually have been deemed close contacts. So won't be playing on Thursday night. So it looks like we may be going with effectively a practice squad running back on Thursday night. So I'm focused on the Senate races. I'm focused on the presidential, and I have not focused on House races. I've been focused on the Packers.
And Jonah's focused on shrooms, and David's off at the Supreme Court. Guys.
You could have taken the word focused out.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for our special election night edition of Dispatch Live. It's time for me to refill my glass and to sit in front of the couch. I've got my cozy travel, the big socks, like the really thick ones with the little grippies on the bottom that aren't slippers, but they're not just socks. They're like in between. I'm sure many of you have them. They are the joy of my life on long campaign nights. They've been with me for a long time. They're not lucky in the sense that I win, because if you know my record, I actually don't win any presidential elections, but they are lucky in the sense that they make me feel good about America. So with that, I hope you all have your version of your fuzzy big socks tonight, that you're in for the long haul with us. See us on Twitter, DMs, email, whatever we'll be up to. And we'll see y'all on the podcast tomorrow. Bye.